Everybody to the February Lunch and Learn lecture series here at the University of South Carolina at Lancaster. Before we get started today, I'd like to make an announcement about next month's lecture on March 19th. I'm delighted to introduce you to one of the newest faculty members at the Lancaster community. Dean Todd Lecken will be speaking. He is a professor of philosophy, and he is our Associate Dean of Academic and Student Affairs. And his lecture is titled, Just Like an Animal, a philosophical examination of our ethical assumptions about cognitive disabilities and the value of animals. And again, that'll be on March 19th. I'm also delighted today to introduce you to one of my archaeological colleagues, S. Margaret Spivey Faulkner, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta. She is a citizen of the Pee Dee Indian Nation of Beaver Creek, which is one of the state-recognized Native American groups here in South Carolina. Her primary work focuses on people who subsisted through hunting and gathering and fishing in the southeastern United States, and she looks specifically at examples of peoples who defy the popular characterizations of hunter-gatherer societal complexity. She also works on a variety of secondary projects, including archaeological applications in United States federal Indian law and Native American philosophy. She's a former junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows, received her PhD in anthropology from Washington University in St. Louis in 2018, and her AB in anthropology from Harvard College in 2008. So without further ado, I give you Maggie Spivey Faulkner. Take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Hey, y'all, how you doing? Thank you so much for inviting me to come talk in the lecture series. It's really, the closer I can get to speaking to people from home, the better. I'm from the Augusta area, so it's exciting to talk to people who are not in temperatures that are below zero, because I can't relate to that right now. So also, sidebar, apologies, my cat is right outside the door, like screaming. So if you hear that, that's what that is. My apologies. So today I'm going to talk to y'all about a project that I've worked on in South Florida. And I'm going to talk to you about it in the context of indigenous archaeology. Okay, so let me share my screen. Share. All right. So hopefully everyone can see that. So this is an analysis of a type of artifact that I'm calling a grotesque for now. It's in these like quotes because I don't know if I'm going to keep calling it that, but we'll get to why in a second. First, let's talk about indigenous archaeology. What do I see as indigenous archaeology? Okay. So in general, most indigenous archaeologies in the modern archaeological practice today is basically a community consultation model. So this is when you consult with and develop projects with descendant communities of the peoples that you're studying archaeologically, right? And a lot of the model of community consultation is built out of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, that was passed in 1990. There's also a little bit in archaeology of indigenized interpretation of archaeological results, right? So what that means is some archaeologists try to take a more emic, like inside the culture point of view to interpret what they find archaeologically, right? So you see this a lot in work on iconography. You see this a lot in work from Mesoamerica, where we have deciphered Maya hieroglyphics, for example. And so you get a more inside look as to what was going on in, at an archaeological site. And it's not really called indigenized though, right? It's not an indigenous archaeology when people are talking about iconography. They're just doing it because it makes sense, right? What I mean when I'm talking about indigenous archaeology is an entire whole model, okay? So first is an indigenized research question. So does the research question have relevance to modern Indigenous people? Is it driven by a modern Indigenous group or individual? Okay, that's got to be step one when you're developing an Indigenous archaeological project. If you have a research question that is based in a concern or interest of an Indigenous group, it follows that your site selection archaeologically is also an indigenized site selection, right? In all types of archaeology, you're choosing the site you're working at based on your research question, or at least they're in conversation with one another when you're developing your project, okay? I also mean an indigenized theoretical paradigm that you work in. Here I've got a picture of Vine Deloria, the most preeminent indigenous, I guess, Native American thinker of the past 100 years, who has a fraught relationship with archaeology, to say the least. But people like him, or Donald Fixico, who is a Muskogee philosopher and ethnohistorian, have theoretical paradigms therefore, published in academic format that can be used by archaeologists as the way you're approaching a project. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit in this presentation about an indigenized analytical method. This is the hardest thing to indigenize because analytical methods come straight out of Western science, and it's necessary that they're comparable across projects to one another for archaeology to work properly, for science to work properly. But I do think there's space here in our analytical methods to indigenize them as well, even though it's extremely difficult. And I'm going to go into that in great detail later, okay? The next is indigenized interpretive methods. Like I said before about iconographic work, archaeologists already do this to a degree or try to dip their toe into it. And what that means is, you do your analysis on research, you have your results, and then you have to interpret those results, find that meaning. And I mean to interpret in an indigenized way. And then finally, and this is the most important facet, is an indigenized dissemination of conclusions. Now, this isn't as hard as like an indigenized analytical method, but it's the most important thing because, I've got like a picture of a bunch of little kids sitting on the floor here at school, right? If we as archaeologists can disseminate the information properly that we develop through archaeological research, it can impact people massively in the modern world today. Okay, those little kids grow up to be legislators, they grow up to be judges, they grow up to be, executives in the executive branch of our governments. And whatever they learn that we've disseminated to them is what they think about Indigenous people and Native people. So we have a burden as archaeologists to make sure that we disseminate our conclusions that fundamentally humanize Indigenous people and can help their day-to-day lives, right? Okay, so that's my kind of model for Indigenous archaeology, my version of Indigenous archaeology. Usually people talk about Indigenous archaeology in the plural, right? Because everyone's doing kind of different things. So what we're going to do here is use that model I just developed and apply it as a case study at a site called Fort Center. Okay, this is just like a little overview so you guys know where we're going in this talk because we get into the weeds. What we're looking at here is an assemblage of 114 zoomorphic wood carvings. So wooden sculptures that look like animals, okay? We're going to talk about how I developed the idea of a type of these artifacts called a grotesque. I'm going to show you guys this analytical method I developed using Southeastern languages. And then we're going to talk about one motif seen in these types called that I'm calling the IO for right now. Okay, where's Fort Center? So the Fort Center archaeological site is in central South Florida. The big lake down here in South Florida, Lake Okeechobee. It's just off the western bank of Lake Okeechobee on a hammock off of Fish Eating Creek here. So just south of Fish Eating Creek, this is a modern map. So the waterways look pretty different now because there's been a lot of changes to the water system in South Florida, post-industrial. But right here is the Caloosahatchee River, and this is the corridor. The Caloosahatchee River dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. So if you were trying to get from the Gulf, okay, to the Atlantic, you would go and use this corridor through the peninsula. You go through the Caloosahatchee River to Lake Okeechobee and out the other side, okay? This is a very common waterway. We know it archaeologically and ethnographically, ethnohistorically. So the site itself was occupied and used for at least 4,000 years. We've never gotten a sterile subsoil in our excavations, so probably longer. There's like a concreted layer we need a jackhammer to get through. And the site itself, as far as we can tell, until the Muskogee expansion south, where the Seminoles started living at this site, the people who lived here were hunters and gatherers and fishers. They never adopted agriculture. They never developed agriculture on their own. You know that the Eastern United States is one of the few centers of independent development of agriculture in the world. And we know that the people who lived at Fort Center hung out with and knew agriculturalists to the north. They traded with them, but they did not adopt that lifestyle. And the site itself has at least 18 monumental constructions on the site. Hopefully we're going, yeah, and I'll tell you about those in a second. And the site itself and the entire region is seen as different from the rest of the Southeast. These are people, again, who did not adopt agriculture, and just all of their material culture looks different. The flora and fauna are different. The environment is different. They're usually excluded from conversations about major Southeastern phenomena. You have publications that are like, we think that maybe the Mississippians interacted with people in South Florida. I mean, they really are seen as a quite different group of people. It's because they are in a lot of ways. So this is a look, okay, again, at South Florida. Here is where Fort Center is. Now, at the time of, we're not quite at European invasion yet, but when the Spanish first start tootling around in Florida on boats, they interact with a people called the Calusa on the southwestern edge of Florida, okay? The Calusa at that moment sort of rule South Florida, or for sure southwestern Florida. They were extremely politically complex and socially complex people. This is a picture of what's right now called Mound Key in Estero Bay, okay, in South Florida. And this is an anthropogenic island that the Calusa built. There wasn't an island here, and then they wanted an island, and so they built it. This is still the highest point in the county in modern times. And a shipwrecked Spanish missionary ended up living here for like a decade. And he learned multiple indigenous languages just living on this island because it was a multi-ethnic community. And this was like the rulership place. The guy in charge, the Spanish called King Kalos. And he had, including Fort Center, were vassal communities from which he demanded tribute. They had monastic marriages. This is a very developed, societally developed group of people, okay, at the moment of contact. So I just want you guys to know that this is like a really meaty community, a broader regional community. Okay, we went back there. All right, so this is the site of Fort Center itself. Like I said, there's at least 18 monumental constructions. I'm not saying like earthworks or mounds, because some of these are, so South Florida has a very different suite of constructions than the rest of the Southeast. Everything here that's red is excavated out. So these are constructions that they dug into the earth, and then everything in blue is mounded, okay? So you get these odd circles and these radiating lines with mounds at the end that seem to be like party spots, right? Like a single deposit of feasting, right? With these sterile sand causeways leading to them. We don't really know a lot about the purposes of these constructions because they are so different from the rest of the Southeast. There's not a lot of archaeological work that happens in the interior of South Florida. So we just don't really know what's going on. So included in that is that we don't really even have a construction chronology of this site. It's a huge site. Look at the scale here. It's really large. What we're talking about today is one assemblage of artifacts from one spot at the site. This is the Mound Pond Complex. So it's two earthen mounds with these kind of like middeny things around them, and then artificially constructed pond. These are the dates we pulled from the pond and the two mounds, okay? So this is not super recent. And it was only used for a couple of hundred years, whereas the rest of the site, like these semicircles are pretty old. They're late Archaic period. So this is the site. This is what we're looking at. Now, I didn't go dig this site, okay? I'm saying here that this is an indigenized method. I have these banners going across the bottom so you guys can keep up with how this fits into my indigenous model. But these are indigenous methods because I'm working on a museum collection. I'm not doing new excavation here. I am following through on the promise that archaeologists made to indigenous people, which is that, oh, no, we need this stuff because we're studying it. So I'm actually studying it, right? A lot of times that promise is not fulfilled. Here, and you'll see in a second, these are really charismatic artifacts from an extremely important site that had just been languishing on shelves for decades. And I think they have real use in dispelling bad ideas about indigenous people not having the capability or skill to make these high artistic artifacts, right? Because of the stylistic nature of most art that comes from the Americas isn't, totally one-to-one depictions. This is like a one-to-one depiction, okay? So this is what the pond of that Mound Pond complex looked like before excavation. So Sears he was a professor from Florida Atlantic. He also worked at the University of Florida's museum, which at the time was called the Florida State Museum, and he ran a series of National Science Foundation funded excavations at the site from 1966 to 1971. Okay, so, and this started because a local person had pulled a carving out and found it and showed it to him, okay? So this is what the pond looked like. You can see there's like random wood sticking out. This is what the excavation looked like. This is not how we excavate today, usually, certainly not academic excavations. They had the bulldozers out. They had a massive pumping system to keep this area dry enough to conduct excavation. And what they found in this pond was commingled secondary human remains burials and a lot of preserved wood, okay? There's no excavation field notes. I mean, there's enough to know that they had a field notebook and it has like 2 or 3 pages written in it. There really just like aren't detailed records from this near decade of excavations. The only really detailed record that we have are the plan view drawings, which are extremely detailed. But I will say the one really great thing they did here was the way they preserved the wood. I don't know how many people know about the assemblage of wood artifacts that came out of Key Marco, which is in southwestern Florida on the coast. But those artifacts just kind of dried and deteriorated and crumbled. Sears was pretty concerned about that. So when they pulled wood out, they impregnated it in 50-gallon or 50, the big barrels of an emulsion of Elmer's glue and water. And it worked really well, actually. Really preserved the artifacts. Not ideal. covering things in Elmer's glue, but the artifacts are still in decent shape. So this is the mound that comes into the edge of the pond. And this is important. I want you guys just, this one little shot of the stratigraphy here, see that this A layer is kind of what Sears called a backfill. It's like sandy and white. This B layer is really important for his interpretation of what happened or what was going on at this area of the site. And it's lenses of black mud mixed into white sandy soil, like what you see in strata A. C here is the commingled layer of the wood and the human remains, and D is the basal midden that lined the bottom of the artificial pond. Also some alligator poop, I think. So keep in mind that this was a pond that had alligators in it. So that, I think, would affect our interpretation of how people are interacting with it if it's full of giant alligators. Anyway, so let's look at what these artifacts look like in situ and talk about how like detailed these plan view drawings are. Here's one of the artifacts in situ, okay? This is, so they had these really detailed plan view drawings, massive ones. And then if there were important artifacts, they would draw them on these little scraps of paper and staple them to the plan view drawings. Here is this same artifact, okay? This is what it looks like today. Here's an illustration I had made of it. So you can see there's not really a lot of change in the overall morphology of this artifact. The shape, we can, and this is repeated over and over again in the assemblage, that the shape the artifacts were in when they came out of the pond is how they look today on the shelves, which is incredible. Let me see here, am I forgetting something? Yeah, talked about the glue. Okay, so what do we have? So we end up with, this is a couple of these artifacts. A lot of them are in really great condition. And you can see here, they really are these charismatic, naturalistic depictions of animals. Here you see, this is the artifact we just saw in situ from the other side. Some sort of an animal with his legs down and his head to the side. Here you have a kind of, they call this a swan, but it's not a swan. Why would it be a swan? It's some sort of a heron, I think. You can see the wings here and a neck. I mean, this is like a pretty obvious, it's often called a cat looking down with the little ears. This is a cat running in motion, a roseate spoonbill's head, some sort of a bird with its wings up in the air. This is the most famous artifact from the site, which is usually called an eagle with its head craning down. So we have all these artifacts, and the questions we have to ask are, what are they? Okay, why are they in the pond? And what kind of cultural meaning can we derive from these artifacts? Okay, so Sears had an idea of what was going on here. In his model, okay, he developed post-excavation. This was a wooden dock platform built over this artificial pond, okay? That those carvings we just saw are all artifacts that serve the same function, okay? And that function is to serve as pilings with a decorative bit on the top that held up the edges of this dock, right? And that people were retrieving human remains, bundling them up, and then placing them on top of this platform, okay? He then theorized that there was a fire that destroyed the platform, and then that people were walking down into the pond to pull out the bundles, to bring them back on top of the mound where he thought that the treatment was occurring. And then that process of walking back and forth put those lenses of dark mud into the white sand, right? That B layer we saw. This is odd. This is a weird thing to say, okay, for a lot of reasons. One, we have nothing like this anywhere in the rest of the Southeast. And we know for a fact that there is great antiquity in Florida of watery burials, okay? So the Wendover site is like, thousands and thousands and thousands of years older than Fort Center. And there they were secondarily bundling their loved ones who had passed and staking them to the bottom of a pond. This is a burial type that has great antiquity in Florida and not really a thing you see anywhere else in the Southeast. But Sears thinks that this is what's going on. As you can see, the next slide is called refutation. So I don't buy it because the data doesn't bear it out. So there wasn't a catastrophic fire event. Only 11 of the 219 wooden artifacts, 114 of which are zoomorphic, of all these wooden artifacts, only 11 of them have any evidence that there was a burning. So it's unlikely there was a catastrophic fire. And these pieces of wood, they're very finely hewn. There's a lot of detail in them, and there's no connective facets, right? So if you have something like a platform or a dock, I would expect there to be connective pieces, lashing material, something to show how the thing was connected. And there are architectural pieces, a lot of them in the wooden assemblage that's not zoomorphic, but none of them indicate a horizontal structure, okay? Again, there's no horizontally oriented planks or poles in the assemblage, and there are vertically oriented ones. And you can tell just by looking at the shape of how they're carved. So the vertical poles have points at the end, and then they taper. And then there's like little notches that you can attach other wood to at like a high angle if it was held vertically, right? That's not a structure it doesn't make any sense horizontally. There's no planks, there's nothing like that. And from looking at the figural depictions in this wood, they are not all degraded forms of the type that are on these poles. So there is one type that is easily construed as some sort of a piling, but they're not all that type. And we'll get to that in a second. And then I don't know if I put it here, but the other thing is the ones that are intact, right, that have tenons, like a mortise and tenon, the ones that have like the pole with the bird or whatever carved on top, they're not tall enough, right? So if you were to plant those firmly into the floor of that artificial pond, they would be underwater at the water level. So this Sears's idea is just not really, no, it's not what's going on. We're gonna nullify that hypothesis, okay? So what's going on now then? We're back at square one with this assemblage. We still don't know what the objects are. We don't know why they're in the pond. We don't know their meaning. And we're more lost than, when we had Sears's model to at least test, okay? So at this point, I got to figure out what's going on here. So the first thing I did is I went back to the old school archaeology. I started making some typologies. And I'm saying as an archaeologist rather than as an indigenous person, there's something that feels really special about making artifact typologies. Like I feel like A.V. Kidder or something, like 1910. But I had to make two, right? So I made a typology of what were these artifacts function? Like how did you physically use these? And then a separate typology of what figures are being depicted on the artifacts. So past analyses of these artifacts were close to non-existent. Sears kind of did a short 5-page write-up in his book about them, and they commingled these two facets. I'm disentangling them here. So let's for a second talk about function, okay? I did this analysis where I looked at the shapes and, did some thinking, compared them to other artifact types, and I developed this typology of function, okay? So we have two broad categories. We have utilitarian artifacts like mortars and pestles, that type of stuff, architectural pieces. And then the 114 iconographic artifacts, okay? We're only going to talk about one type here because otherwise we'd be here for a year. We're only going to talk about the grotesques, okay? There's a bunch of other ones as you can see here, but we don't have time. So let's talk about these grotesques. What's a grotesque? So these artifacts, right, the commonalities that group them together in terms of their shape and their morphology right, is that they are what Sears called these tenoned animal carvings. So they're vertically oriented. The bottom half to 2/3 is like a pole, right, that's been carved. And the top part is a depiction of an animal, okay? These are always, the grain of the wood is always in one particular direction. It's very consistent. The form that the animals take is extremely consistent across all of these artifacts. And so I grouped them together. You really only see two types of motif or figure in these. Okay, is it gonna go? Yeah, you really only see two kind of motifs in this set of artifacts. Okay, and we'll get to that in the figural depictions more, but they're this kind of carnivoran figure that you could easily call a cat, but I don't want to go that far. And then this raptorial bird, the only two types of animals depicted um, in these artifacts. I still didn't know really like what the function of these artifacts were. I just knew that they served a similar or same function because they were all shaped the same way. And as I was describing them in my notes, I kept noticing that I was referring to the figures as a downturned raptor or a downturned carnivoran, right? Because they have this like arc in their necks where they're looking down. And then I noticed that this one also had like a real directionality in terms of where the figure is facing. And this is the only one that's looking to the side. It's a directly 90 degrees. And this artifact is smaller than the other ones. And there's less vertical distortion in the carving. Okay. So then I thought maybe that it's not the figure, it's not like a figure that needs to be looking down. Then maybe there's something called, I've been calling it implied observational directionality going on, right? It's like a fancy academic word for which way is this looking? And so which way are you looking at it from? Okay. And from below, if they're looking down, you're looking at them from below. So I came up with this hypothesis that these artifacts were meant to be seen from below. And so I was like, well, maybe they're on the roofs of buildings. Is this a thing? Is there any in the world, architectural or artistic tradition, where there's sculpture on the roofs of buildings? Yes, you see this in Northern European and Western culture, where you get these carved figures on the roofs of buildings. I was calling these gargoyles for a while, which is a really fun name, but apparently gargoyles have to have water shooting out of their mouths. So these are called grotesques, right? And you see they are like looking down. There is a lot of this like implied observational directionality going on. This is far afield though. I mean, we're sitting here, I'm drawing a line from an indigenous South Florida hunter-gatherer artistic tradition and, Western Christian church stuff. And so that's not enough, right? That's not enough evidence to say that these are on the roofs of buildings. So I started looking for more evidence to see if it was there. And I found a bunch. So in the ethnohistoric record, okay, I found the closest one geographically and time-wise to what to this rooftop phenomenon that I hypothesized was going on is from they always say he went to Tampa Bay. This is the Gentleman of Elvas, who visited in 1539, right? So this is again the Calusa who he was interacting with. People say he was in Tampa Bay. I really don't think he was in Tampa Bay. I think he was in Estero Bay at the capital of the Calusa that we talked about earlier. There's a lot, whatever, it's a different talk, why I think that. But most archaeologists in South Florida agree that we have been assuming this guy went to Tampa Bay, but he really went to Estero Bay. And he described where like King Kalos lived on this island. And he said, quote, "The Lord's house stood near the shore upon a very high mount, made by hand for strength. At the other end of the town stood the church, and on top of it stood a fowl made of wood with gilded eyes. And I saw that and I was like, hot damn, I'm onto something, right? We have a nearby ethnohistoric description of a wooden bird with gilded eyes on the roof of a church, right? And keep that structure in mind, okay? Lord's house on a, an artificially built mound, okay? And then across the town square is a church, birds, gilded eyes on the top of it, okay? So I was like, okay. So I started digging more and more into the ethnohistoric documentation just from the Southeast in general. And I found these two illustrations from two different guys, Debatz and Dupratz, right? And this is in 1732 in French Louisiana. This is not nearby, all right? Here on the right, you see the funeral procession of the tattooed serpent. Okay, so this guy has passed away. This is like them going on a procession, right? These arcs are just demonstrating movement and they're headed towards some building. And on top of that building are a triptych of birds that are carved. Now, this is pretty on the nose. I mean, we're talking about a place that is a funerary place, right? This is where humans were laid to rest. And the mound, that the building where they were treating people next to this pond was the place they were dealing with people's remains, right? And so this is exactly what we're seeing here in action. All right. The other illustration from the same year, it shows the same town structure that the gentleman of Elvis described, right? On one side, you have the Cabane du Chef, right? The chief's house. And then on the other, across the town center, you have the Temple of the Savages, Temple des, I don't know, I'm not good at French. But again, on the roof here, you see these more like paella mixed bird rooftop sculptures, okay? So I think it's a pretty compelling amount of ethnohistoric evidence here to indicate that this is the same tradition, okay? There is a fourth piece that a fourth piece of ethnohistoric information that kind of seals it up that I'm gonna come to in a minute. So altogether, right, there's one other archaeological site, this is Hantoon Island, that has some of these artifacts that have been found. But these are the only two sites with the artifacts that have been found like this. There are 4 pieces of ethnohistoric information that show this, that show this kind of rooftop sculptural tradition. So this would be an 1100-year tradition that persisted pretty late in time that people aren't talking about anymore, right? Like modern descendant communities don't talk about this. And that stretches across kind of every boundary that archaeologists would draw, right? Linguistic boundaries for sure. Lifeways, totally different. Environment, completely different. All the other expressions of material culture that you see across this space and time indicates that these shouldn't have anything to do with each other. But I would argue, and this is something I'm calling an indigenized interpretive method, I would argue that it would be easy for you to accept that a church with a cross on it from 600 AD in Tbilisi, Georgia, and a church with a cross on it in modern London, it would be easy for you to understand that while they might not be living the same lives, that one high cultural expression is extremely related and similar. And that's what I'm arguing here. Okay, so what we're seeing is the earliest known iteration of a very long-term pervasive Southeastern religious tradition and cultural tradition that transgress all other cultural boundaries. Okay, so let's for a second dip into the figural typology, okay? Now, Earlier, when I was talking about this one type of artifacts, I said there was a carnivoran figure and a raptorial figure. When I was coming to interpreting what these figures are for my project, I got kind of unhappy with it, with these labels. The reason I got unhappy with it is there's a lot of weight given to the first typologies of something. For the rest of time, as archaeologists, even if the thing shifts, to keep continuity in the literature, you're gonna bring up whatever it was first called. And I wanted to make sure I did it right. And I was thinking through these two categories or labels I had come up with. What are they? Okay. A carnivoran. This is straight from a Linnaean taxonomy, right? It's because I don't want to call it a cat. Maybe it's a bear. Maybe it's a fox. There were some that others thought were a fox. I don't know. It's taxonomic, like in a scientific way. What's a raptor? That's not even a taxonomic unit, right? In science. That's something that's derived from Anglo-American folk taxonomy, okay? In reality, when we're comparing raptor to the Linnaean taxonomy, it's really a bunch of different families, right? And so I figure, and especially now, these days, we know that the original and even the recent Linnaean taxonomic units that scientists have relied on, once we started being able to do genetic analysis and looking at phylogeny, right, the analysis of that genetic information, and the categorization of, you know, when things evolved, a lot of even Linnaean taxonomy is turning out to be folk. Okay, so what do I mean by folk? So this is a Linnaean taxonomy on the right. A folk taxonomy is how you colloquially categorize things, right? So a raptor is a folk taxonomic unit. That's how, in the culture that Americans live in, we categorize that animal. It doesn't have a lot to do with science. And like I said, some of the Linnaean taxonomy work, which is usually just based on morphology, right? The shape of an animal, the shape of its insides, right? The shape of different organs, different elements. Some of that turned out to be folk too. So I thought, why not use an indigenous folk taxonomy? If I'm already out in the ether a bit, I don't know if it's a cat or not, right? And I'm calling stuff raptors. Why not use an indigenous folk taxonomic structure? So I tried to build that, right? This is that tough indigenized analytical method that I tried to make happen here. It's the hardest part, right? And so what I did is I built a pan-Southeastern folk taxonomy of animals. And I did that through a linguistic analysis. Now, as you saw with the dates from this site, and just like, I can't be sure what language these people spoke. The people who live in South Florida now are Muskogee. The people who lived there when this stuff was made were not. And so what I tried to do was pull from as many different families of languages as possible in the Southeast, because I hypothesized that if I found similar structures, like the categorization of animals, if I found a similar categorical structure of animals across multiple Southeastern languages, that might hold some salience, right? So perhaps that reflects a broader indigenous Southeastern view of how animals were categorized colloquially. Okay, so I went through 5 languages, okay? Some of these are not particularly developed out, like Timucua, there's not a lot of data. And some of them are extremely well developed out, like Cherokee and Muskogee, right? So I did something called a lexical item analysis, okay? And then I, again, looked for these like taxonomic structures across languages, and then I combined them into the Pan-Southeastern taxonomy. So this is the data I collected. Arlene Fradkin, who just passed away recently, did this with Cherokee for her dissertation like 4 decades ago. And so that was already in existence. And then I did it for Muskogee, Catawba, Caddo, and Timucua as well. Some of them worked better than others. I am kind of an intermediate level Muskogee speaker. So obviously, or I think it makes sense that that worked. I thought that was the easiest because I knew the language. I don't know all these other languages. So what's a lexical item analysis? Pretty simple. You have a primary lexical item like the word oak, and then you have a secondary lexical item like red, oak, black, oak, live oak, right? So the secondary lexical item is modifying the primary lexical item. And you can assume that if you're modifying, right, if you're saying white oak, that it's a type of oak. Pretty simple. This maps super easily onto Muskogee. So you have something like Jeddo, which is a snake, okay? You got Jedolane, green snake, Jedolanuche, little green snake, Chedomiko, king snake, right? Cheto, Cheto yuppie. It works pretty well. So I did this and came up with these different taxonomic units that were alike across different Southeastern languages, okay? Let me see here, make sure I didn't forget something. And the great thing about linguistic information and building these folk taxonomies is that culture is embedded in it fundamentally. And it's a data set completely separate from archaeology. So you're not getting any kind of tautological like spiral going on here, right? They're totally different data sets. So these are the ones I found that were more pan-Southeastern. When we're talking about, let's just focus on this kind of raptorial figure for a second, okay? Things like rabbit, that's not describing a raptorial bird, right? So I narrowed it down to which of these could possibly be describing this raptorial figure. There's only a couple. There's hawk, owl, bird, duck, and turkey or peafowl. But like, this ain't a turkey, y'all. It just isn't, and it's not a duck. We have ducks in the assemblage, but not in this type of artifact. So really, and owls too, their heads are really chonky, right? So really, I narrowed it down to hawk and bird. Let's look at the individual species that are categorized under hawk and bird in this kind of analysis, okay? So this is the bird Fuzwa, right? This is what in Southeastern, this kind of pan-Southeastern folk taxonomy is considered just a bird, right? So you have things like golden eagles, bats, mockingbirds. It's sort of like our word for bird in English, right? It's just like a bird plus a bat, right? The shapes, look at the shapes of these birds, okay? Other than the golden eagle, they don't really look like the carvings we've been looking at, right? This has a very horizontalized kind of body shape. It's not upright like the figure we have seen, okay? So maybe, right? Let's look at the hawk category, Ayo, okay? The hawk category for Southeastern languages is also not, well, it's not really like the hawk category for in Anglo-American culture. It includes things like passenger pigeons, doves, pigeon hawks, and then just kind of other hawks. There's like a mythical hawk. This is an odd category. I found it kind of uncomfortable because it's got like predator and prey in it. It's not something that an archaeologist or a scientist would develop. It feels foreign. But I was really kind of confused about this like passenger pigeon dove inclusion. I was like, what are you doing? And I was like, did I miss something here? Right? Because, you know, we all miss stuff in archaeology. So I went back and looked at the carvings that I was calling raptor, right? And some of them kind of look less like raptorial figures and more like doves or something. They have this rounded head. Let me see if this is this slide or the next one. Yeah. And then now we're going to come to the last piece of ethnohistoric information that really sealed it for me, that these were definitely on the roofs of buildings, and that this Ayo category is the category of, we call it a figural referent, right? So the folk taxonomic category that the artists carving this were depicting is this kind of hawk figure. And it's from Adair much later, okay? And he says he's describing visiting a Choctaw cemetery, okay? So again, we're in the correct space that the archaeological collection was found in. And he's describing the house where Funerary rites were undertaken. And he says, quote, on the top was the carved image of a dove, it's with its wings stretched out and its head inclining down as if earnestly viewing or watching over the bones of the dead. And it's just, it's this. I mean, like maybe it's not, but I'm pretty sure it is. Okay. Which is wild. Like, because that 8 hour is much later, much, much later. Okay. Um, all right, so let's talk for just a second about Io in the Southeast. We didn't talk about any of the other figural depictions or animals or anything in the rest of this assemblage. But I can tell you that I think this is a colleague of mine named Daniel Seinfeld thought of this first. But we think this structure on site was kind of a cosmogram of the cosmology of Southeastern and indigenous peoples. You have these bird, apex predator animals on the roof of the buildings. The artifacts that you see that were used on ground level match up with the sort of cosmological figures that are at the ground level. And then they literally built a watery underworld through which the dead travel to their final resting place, which is like what you see. And it's kind of incredible. It's the other sidebar interesting thing is that the figures depicted in these like ground level artifacts match a lot of the figures depicted on like Fort Jackson pottery, right? And ceramics, which is a very different set of taxa than you see in the ones on the buildings, on the roofs of the buildings. Anyway, so yeah, we zoomed in a little bit. So I've done this for a few of the other artifacts. Some of them are identified. Again, this is that Io figure. This guy, this is the one artifact that I'm pretty sure was beside a pathway. It was at ground level, which I still like not quite sure. We could go Kacha, which is like a cat figure. Ngozi is a bear. This is some sort of could be a turkey, benwa, or maybe like some sort of paeza, which is sorry, I don't know why I just pronounced paeza with a Muskogee accent. That's Spanish, where it's like a mix of multiple animals, like you see in the one illustration, and then it's a duck, fugo. They look like decoy ducks. There's a bunch of them. I mean, if they weren't broken, I swear they could float. Anyway, I'm working on that in full. So a few conclusions here so we can wrap this thing up. Like John giving away the answer to the talk at the very beginning, I'm not the first one to like think about or talk about the rooftop sculptural tradition in South Florida and everywhere else in the Southeast. This is oh man, his name just flew out of my head. Merle, I think. Is the illustrator who does all these lovely illustrations of Calusa culture. And he gets down into like deep detail, right? And so for the first time I presented this sort of interpretation of mine, I was like, I'm going to get that like famous illustration he did of King Kalos, which is who is here, and put a little bird or sculpture on top of the buildings, or one of the buildings. And you can see he already did it. They're here. I mean, they're not quite right. They weren't on every building. They were only on a few of the buildings. And they were the ones for this exact purpose, as far as I can tell. But they're there. People have been thinking about these and how they interacted with humans in their daily life. Now, I don't know if you guys noticed, but I haven't explained how these got in the pond yet. Right? How they get into the pond. What I think is that they're being treated as revered members of the community. And so when, for whatever reason, the life of an individual sculpture is deemed to have ended, they're being treated as members of the community and placed into the pond the same way that other members of the community are when their life has passed. That's how I think they got into the pond. There's a lot of other stratigraphic information that indicates that they're just like kind of put in randomly. Anyway, and then let's see here. I had one more thing here that I wanted to say. Yeah, wait, where'd it go? I lost it. Yeah, and I think that here, the people at Fort Center are participating in a pan-Southeastern tradition rooted in a pan-Southeastern cosmological structure. There is less disjuncture between some really important parts of life for the people in South Florida than every other piece of material culture can indicate it. And I think that says something about like how archaeological methodologies can bias our interpretation of sites, right? We're so focused on the remnant that we have left that we blow up smaller differences into huge gulfs that maybe aren't gulfs at all. And that people in South Florida and indigenous people everywhere are living multi-ethnic, interactive lives and doing human stuff. So if we really want to get deep with it, I think you could argue that not only do we have this 1100-year-old tradition, but through the Fort Center connection here, right, where you have the connection of this rooftop tradition, the earliest iteration we know of this rooftop tradition. So this isn't peripheral involvement. It's like real involvement here, okay? With that pond and that type of watery burial, you get into some really deep time connections across the rest of Florida. And I think there's something to be said here about both the continuity of tradition over time to the point of this Fort Center phenomenon, and then how those deep traditions can change and can continue to be a part of communities in a different form, but with a deep historical trajectory. Okay, so thank y'all for inviting me here. I really appreciate it, and I hope y'all thought that was interesting.
All right. Thank you, Maggie. Great lecture. We'll give you